What most Americans don't realize about the transportation crisis exploding across the continental United States right now is that when Donald Trump publicly demanded $540 billion in Canadian railway assistance, yesterday he wasn't proposing infrastructure cooperation. He was begging for a bailout of American transportation failures. And when Mark Carney's counteroffer went viral within hours, generating more international attention than any infrastructure summit in history, it didn't just reject American demand. It offered to solve America's railway crisis through Canadian management of American infrastructure, exposing the complete institutional collapse of American transportation planning in the most humiliating terms possible. The shockwaves rippling through American transportation markets tonight aren't just about freight delays or passenger service disruptions, though both of those problems are becoming catastrophic for American economic competitiveness. They're about the sudden realization that the world's largest economy has allowed its transportation infrastructure to deteriorate so completely that a smaller neighbor is now offering to manage American railways because American institutions have proven incapable of operating them effectively. I've spent decades watching American institutional capacity operate through frameworks that assumed domestic infrastructure challenges could be managed through domestic solutions with international partnerships providing supplemental support rather than operational management. What we're seeing today represents the complete inversion of that framework where American transportation policy has become so dysfunctional that Canadian management isn't just an alternative anymore. It's a necessity that American institutional incompetence has made strategically inevitable. The railway crisis currently devastating American freight and passenger transportation isn't just about aging infrastructure or maintenance backlogs, though both of those problems are catastrophic. It's about the end of American assumptions that transportation policy is a domestic issue that can be managed through domestic institutions. And Trump's plea for Canadian railway bailout reveals just how completely those assumptions have collapsed. Let me walk you through what actually happened here, because the surface story completely misses the profound infrastructure dependency that this moment exposes for American transportation policy. Once you understand why Trump was reduced to requesting over $500 billion in railway assistance from Canada, and why Carney's counteroffer was so strategically devastating, you'll see why this decision may mark the beginning of a transportation crisis that American institutions are fundamentally incapable of addressing. The official version sounds almost reasonable until you examine the context. Facing unprecedented strain on American freight railways, collapsing passenger rail service, and growing economic pressure from transportation bottlenecks that threaten supply chain functionality, Trump proposed what his team called a Continental Railway Security Partnership with Canada. The framework would have provided American railways with access to Canadian rail technology, Canadian logistics expertise, and Canadian transportation financing at rates significantly below what comparable assistance costs in international markets. The deal was structured as emergency infrastructure assistance worth approximately $540 billion over 10 years, essentially treating Canadian railway capacity as a rescue mechanism for American transportation policy dysfunction. From Trump's perspective, this was American leadership solving an American crisis through neighborly cooperation. The logic was familiar. Canada benefits from American economic partnerships. So pressure applied correctly would secure railway assistance that American transportation infrastructure desperately needs at prices American institutions can actually afford. The problem with that logic is that it assumes Canadian railway capacity exists primarily to solve American transportation problems rather than serve Canadian economic objectives. It assumes Canadian rail resources are available for American consumption regardless of Canadian transportation priorities. And most catastrophically, it assumes that Canada has any obligation to subsidize the failures of American infrastructure policy through below transportation assistance. When Carney was asked about Trump's railway bailout request during a transportation conference in Montreal. His response was so direct and so strategically devastating that it immediately went viral across international infrastructure communities. He didn't engage with the specifics of American railway needs. He didn't offer modified terms or suggest alternative transportation arrangements. Instead, he announced that Canada was prepared to address American railway dysfunction through a comprehensive infrastructure management partnership that would place Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Railway in operational control of key American freight corridors, with Canadian transportation expertise managing American passenger rail systems that American institutions had proven incapable of operating effectively. Then came the moment that broke the internet and shocked transportation experts worldwide. When asked whether this represented Canadian annexation of American infrastructure, Carney delivered what may be the most devastating assessment any Allied leader has ever made of American institutional competence. This isn't annexation. This is professional management of critical infrastructure that requires institutional competence rather than political theater. The phrase professional management has now been viewed over 70 million times in the past 12 hours. It's been translated into dozens of languages, analyzed by infrastructure and economic policy experts around the world, and turned into diplomatic messaging that every serious infrastructure economy is studying for its implications about the future of American institutional credibility. But the viral moment wasn't just about transportation policy. It was about the institutional sophistication that made such confident infrastructure management offers possible. You don't propose managing $540 billion worth of foreign infrastructure unless you have $540 billion worth of superior operational capacity already demonstrated. And Canada had been building that capacity for years while American attention was focused elsewhere. Canadian National Railway, operating as one of the most efficient freight transportation systems in North America, has been demonstrating operational excellence that American freight railways have been unable to match despite decades of deregulation and private investment. Canadian Pacific Railway has maintained service reliability and infrastructure quality that American railways abandon in pursuit of short-term profit maximization. Canadian passenger rail systems, while modest compared to European standards, operate with on-time performance and service quality that American Amtrak systems have never achieved, despite billions in federal subsidies and repeated reform efforts. Canadian transportation planning operates under institutional frameworks that prioritize long-term infrastructure development over short-term political considerations. Canadian rail technology development, supported by government investment and private sector innovation, has created transportation solutions that American railways need but cannot develop due to institutional dysfunction and regulatory complexity that prevents long-term infrastructure planning. In other words, while American transportation policy was focused on deregulation and crisis management, Canada was building institutional transportation capacity based on operational excellence, long-term planning, and sustainable infrastructure development. When that capacity matured, American transportation dependency became strategically irrelevant. The immediate impact of Carney's management offer on American transportation planning has been catastrophic in ways that most Americans are only beginning to understand. Railway systems that American freight companies depend on suddenly face Canadian management alternatives that expose the operational inadequacy of American transportation institutions. American freight railways that have been deferring maintenance, reducing service quality, and maximizing shareholder returns rather than infrastructure investment are discovering that Canadian operational standards make American railway management appear incompetent by comparison. The transportation infrastructure that American logistics depends on cannot compete with Canadian alternatives when Canadian efficiency is directly contrasted with American dysfunction. Passenger rail systems that American politicians have been promising to improve for decades suddenly face Canadian management offers that could deliver service quality improvements that American institutions have proven incapable of achieving. The transportation services that American communities depend on represent infrastructure capacity that American institutional policy never adequately developed. Supply chain logistics that had been calculating transportation costs based on American railway inefficiency are discovering that Canadian management could reduce costs and improve reliability in ways that fundamentally alter continental transportation economics. Freight transportation that has sustained American economic competitiveness represents infrastructure capacity that American management has systematically degraded through short-term thinking. But the deeper crisis isn't operational, it's institutional. What Trump's railway bailout request reveals is the extent to which American transportation functionality has become dependent on institutional incompetence that Canadian management expertise could address through professional administration rather than political theater. The institutional sophistication required to offer comprehensive infrastructure management demonstrates something that American transportation planners have consistently underestimated about Canadian operational capacity. This wasn't a reactive response to American transportation dysfunction. This was a proactive demonstration of institutional competence that exposes the inadequacy of American infrastructure management. Canadian transportation officials have been building operational excellence for years, investing in railway technology that doesn't require accommodating American institutional dysfunction, developing logistics expertise that operates independently of American regulatory chaos, and creating infrastructure management systems that serve economic efficiency rather than political positioning. The management capacity that enabled this infrastructure offer wasn't emergency assistance developed in response to American transportation failures. It was carefully developed institutional competence designed to demonstrate superior operational capacity while exposing the inadequacy of American infrastructure management approaches. American intelligence services that failed to predict this strategic transportation often face uncomfortable questions about their ability to assess infrastructure vulnerabilities created by domestic institutional dysfunction. When your analytical frameworks can't anticipate infrastructure management offers that expose fundamental American transportation inadequacy, your assessments of actual infrastructure security threats become questionable. The constitutional implications reflect the same institutional inadequacy that has characterized American responses to infrastructure challenges throughout this crisis. When vital American infrastructure requires management expertise from foreign institutions that possess superior operational competence, the constitutional framework encounters challenges it wasn't designed to address through traditional mechanisms. The current transportation crisis can only be addressed through institutional cooperation with transportation managers who no longer consider American infrastructure dysfunction their responsibility to accommodate. When those managers have demonstrated superior alternatives to American Transportation Administration, constitutional tools designed to manage domestic challenges become irrelevant to international infrastructure management. Carney's strategic genius becomes clear when you understand this moment as part of a comprehensive infrastructure realignment designed to demonstrate Canadian transportation competence while offering operational management solutions that American institutions have proven incapable of implementing. The railway management offer didn't just address American transportation needs, it redefined the entire framework for continental infrastructure cooperation. Instead of treating Canadian transportation expertise as emergency assistance for American infrastructure problems, Carney positioned Canadian management capacity as superior operational alternatives to American Transportation Administration. The broader demonstration effect extends far beyond North American infrastructure relationships. When a middle power country can offer to manage critical infrastructure of the world's largest economy due to institutional incompetence, every other infrastructure capable country begins reconsidering its own relationship with American transportation dysfunction. European railway companies have quietly begun exploring infrastructure management partnerships with countries that demonstrate operational competence. Asian transportation firms have accelerated development of infrastructure cooperation frameworks that don't require managing American institutional dysfunction. This isn't anti-American infrastructure policy. This is rational transportation management by countries that recognize infrastructure competence as economic competitive advantage and are willing to demonstrate operational superiority when American institutions prove inadequate to basic transportation management requirements. The domestic political consequences for American transportation policy are particularly severe because communities most affected by railway dysfunction provided the strongest support for deregulation policies that promise to improve American transportation through private sector efficiency rather than institutional competence. Rural communities that have lost passenger rail service due to American institutional failures are discovering that Canadian management could restore transportation access that American deregulation eliminated. Industrial regions that depend on freight rail reliability are facing transportation costs and delays that Canadian management could address through operational competence. From a policy perspective, what's most troubling about this transportation crisis isn't the immediate infrastructure impact. Though that impact will reshape American economic competitiveness permanently. It's what this moment reveals about American institutional capacity to understand and respond to infrastructure challenges that require operational competence rather than political management. When your approach to transportation policy is to treat infrastructure as political positioning rather than operational necessity, you're not building competitive advantages. You're advertising institutional dysfunction while pretending to demonstrate free market efficiency. And dysfunction becomes visible the moment foreign institutions offer superior management alternatives. The technology and infrastructure dimension adds another layer of strategic significance that American transportation policy completely missed. Canadian railway management doesn't just offer operational assistance. It demonstrates comprehensive infrastructure competence that includes technological and institutional capacity necessary for modern transportation system management. Canadian investment in railway technology, logistics optimization, and infrastructure management systems creates competitive advantages that translate directly into operational superiority. American transportation institutions constrained by regulatory complexity and short-term political considerations fell behind in infrastructure management approaches that matter to modern economic competitiveness. Looking forward, the most concerning aspect of this transportation crisis isn't the immediate infrastructure disruption, though that disruption will reshape American economic geography permanently. It's what this moment reveals about American institutional incapacity to adapt to infrastructure challenges that require long-term operational thinking rather than short-term political positioning. When transportation competitiveness becomes dependent on institutional management from countries that have developed superior alternatives to American infrastructure administration, American policy tools designed for domestic political management become counterproductive. The more political theater America applies, the more attractive those management alternatives become. Canada's transportation strategy demonstrates exactly this dynamic in action. Every American infrastructure failure provided additional justification for Canadian officials to develop superior management capacity. Every assumption of American transportation superiority created incentives for Canadian operational excellence. The viral response that exploded tonight isn't just about transportation infrastructure. It's about the recognition that institutional competence has become more valuable than economic size, when countries demonstrate superior management capacity for critical infrastructure. The path back to credible American transportation leadership won't come through louder demands for Canadian infrastructure, bailouts, or more creative political positioning about American transportation greatness. It will come through rebuilding the institutional competence that makes American infrastructure management effective. That means infrastructure investment that prioritizes operational excellence rather than political symbolism. It means transportation planning that addresses long-term economic needs rather than short-term political positioning. It means railway management that creates efficient transportation rather than depending on foreign expertise to operate American infrastructure. Whether American political institutions can sustain that kind of fundamental infrastructure reform remains to be seen. But until they can, we should expect more moments like this one where American assumptions about infrastructure superiority meet Canadian realities about management competence. And America discovers that economic size is not an effective substitute for operational excellence. The choice facing American transportation planners isn't whether to compete with Canadian management capacity. That capacity is already operational and already demonstrating infrastructure competence that American systems can no longer match. The choice is whether to rebuild American transportation relationships based on operational excellence or to accept foreign management of American infrastructure. History shows that once a country loses its infrastructure advantage due to institutional failure, regaining it is exceptionally difficult. That Canada was able to step in with a fully operational management offer while preserving diplomatic relations only underscores the magnitude of the American institutional failure. Trump's request for a Canadian railway bailout was not merely a policy proposal. It was an acknowledgement that U.S. transportation infrastructure now relies on foreign expertise rather than domestic capability. Carney's response went beyond traditional assistance. It was a demonstration that professional management outperforms political theater when functional infrastructure is at stake. The viral lesson is stark. Operational competence outweighs national pride when transportation systems demand real performance. Canada did not seize American infrastructure. It offered to manage it because American institutions had proven unable to do so themselves.